At this point, I should grow taller. Generally speaking, at this point, the stage manager would walk in and say, at today's meeting, the role of moderator will be done by Joe Langsam. Unfortunately, David Blaskowski, who was to be our moderator, has come down ill. So the role fell to me. Okay. What we're going to do is each of the panel members will take about 8 minutes to talk. That includes me. I'll take a lot less. And then we'll throw it open for questions. Particularly, I'm interested to know from the audience where you think the need for standards doesn't exist. Okay. Una, if you would please start. Talk about the importance.
Yes, indeed. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today, and I'm very pleased to talk. You'll all hear from my accent that I was not born and brought up in America. So I'm going to give a UK perspective on this and talk about the kind of standards which I think should be in place. I want to refer particularly to SVB because it's a rather good example for what I want to talk about. I also want to say, yes, the regulators were asleep at the wheel, but I don't think the blame should always be on the regulators for the collapse of the bank, because that stops us from looking at the way in which the bank actually conducted its affairs. So here I want to look particularly at the boards of banks and the comparison with the UK and with the board of SVB puts the board of SVB in a pretty useless position, frankly. And I also want to say that the tools that we have had here, presented here, particularly in the last presentation, extremely helpful, extremely useful, and I can see a use for these tools, but not just at the chief executive level. These tools should be also be available to be understood at the level of the board. So I want to talk a little bit about how a board has to be structured for banks in the UK and for other financial institutions as well. When I look at the SVB board, and I went carefully through all their CVs as submitted to the SEC, and I find that virtually none of them, except for one who was appointed late in September and then put to my mind on the wrong committee, communications instead of risk management, because he seemed to know a bit more about that than any of the others did. None of them would have passed muster. Why not? First of all, a long process of selection is required for appointing members of a board in the UK. The requirements are that they have to have the relevant skills, knowledge, and experience, and this has to be demonstrable. They also, to use the old-fashioned English language, they have to be fit and proper, which means honest and competent. So SVP, well, we do get, and I think that's extremely important that you go through this proper process of selection. Once you have selected your proposed board members, they have to go for approval before the FCA and the PRA, because the checks have to be made that these people are actually honest and competent and have all the relevant skills, knowledge, and experience. I don't see any of the SVB board members actually meeting those criteria, and they would not have been allowed to be appointed to run a bank, particularly as the bank seemed to be unable to monitor and control interest rate and effects and depositor concentration. Secondly, what about the structure of the board? I want to concentrate on two committees of the board. Others are relevant, but not mainly today. And that's the head of audit and the head of risk management. These have to be independent directors. And they are particularly, obviously, responsible for looking after those particular areas of banking. I should also mention, which I should have mentioned first, the chairman of the board has to meet those criteria. The chairman is separate from the chief executive, but not just as here for chairing the board meetings. A chairman is expected for a large bank to be available at the headquarters of the bank for about 3 days a week. He can also receive communications on a private nature, if necessary, from the head of internal audit, from the head of audit, and from the head of risk management, and also from executive directors or other members of those departments. So, in other words, the chairman has a seriously responsible role in relation to the chief executive. Ideally, of course, the chairman and the chief executive should be able to work together, as indeed the board should be able to work together with the executive managers. But on the other hand, it's a necessary counterbalance. The chairman and the board members can be responsible for sacking senior executives and indeed the CEO if there are serious considerations for doing so. I have actually been on one of these board meetings where we had to sack the chief executive of an insurance company. It was a long and painful process, and not one that I would like to go through every day of the week. But you have that balance there, and that is very important. You have the checks on a CEO who is failing to carry out his duties. I think that the tools that we have set out in the previous would be absolutely ideal for use for the board, both for the executive members of the board to explain more fully to the board what exactly they have taken on in terms of who owes money to whom, I like that summary, and what is the risks of the loans involved in that particular relationship. And that could also be for board members, and I want to sort of stress different uses of ACTUS. I think they would be very useful indeed for training days for board members, which as independent board members were expected to undergo. The board meetings in the UK have a predominance of independent members of the board, but executive members are also members of the board. Very important, because we don't just have, as you have on a two-tier board system, which I've also sat on in Sweden, you don't just have a member of the board, a member of the executive team coming to give a presentation and then disappears. Instead, because you're working together, you get to know the executive members of the board extremely well, and that puts you in a position to understand very clearly how well they are performing, whether or not you should accept their presentations, and so on. So the integration of the independent members and the executive members of the board is an extremely important feature. I think I'm going to run out of time pretty quickly, but the last point to be made is you serve for 3 years. You're elected annually by the annual general meeting. You serve for 3 years. If you're good, you'll serve for another 3 years. That makes 6 years. In exceptional circumstances, you will be allowed to serve another 3 years. After 9 years, it's goodbye. And that's it. Thank you very much. But you are regarded as, after 9 years, that you have become part of the company and you are not in a position to give properly independent assessment of the executive team and the way in which the bank strategy is working and how the bank is being run. You are no longer independent. One of the longest serving members of the board of SVB was on the board for 17 years and he was a vineyard owner. I was somewhat at a loss to understand, unless he supplied excellent wine to the board meetings, as to why he was there for 17 years. But term limits, if I mention term limits here, both independent and executive members of the board start trembling. But no, those are strict rules in the UK and the correct rules to have. So skills, experience, knowledge, fit and proper, and term limits on your membership of the board. And I think such a board would find it in a strong position to use all the benefits that the ACTUS system seems to me to provide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John, would you like to say?
So first, let me just begin and thank Alan and the ACTUS team for allowing me to speak today. What I'd like to do in my comments is just speak directly to the importance of standards in finance. Alan, in your presentation, where is Alan? So maybe you left when I got up to talk. In Alan's presentation, he spoke about the challenges with contracts being in natural language versus that being represented in a digitized format. And to me, really, the underlying message there is we are immersed in a drive towards digitization. Right? Everything from banking to ordering lunch on Grubhub, right, is now driven by digitization. Digitization is highly dependent on the adherence to data standards. We live in a digitized world, yet we seem to be reluctant to standardize on the information that drives digitization. Digitization drives clarity, it enhances analytics, and more importantly, it enhances analytic speed. Since, again, we're in a world of incredible speed, we need to have incredible analytics around these transactions. Standards would enable real-time analytics. And if you think about that applied to our world today, not only will it help us in analyzing current situations, but maybe even be proactive in analyzing future issues. Now, I know we've talked about this for 10 years ad infinitum, but I'm going to mention again the financial crisis. And I want to talk about that through the lens of data. We think about what was going on back then. We saw incredible market turmoil. The huge increase in complex investment vehicles were taking place, and we saw tremendous price variances between valuations and price. Now, if you look at the collateralization process, and specifically on mortgages, because that was really the center post of most of the challenges then, you've got mortgages going to banks, banks going to pools, pools going to structured instruments turning into tranches, tranches turning into bonds, and then we, the public, take those instruments with the faith and confidence that those instruments are safe. Right? But what happened along the way was we lost critical elements of that data because of a lack of standard information and processes. And just a simple example, and I heard this back then, I think it was the SEC that reported that on 80% of the data flowing from that process, a critical element, first-time homeowner flag, was missing. So if you think about from a risk analysis perspective, that's a pretty important element to be missing on 80% of the reported mortgages. Links to the underlying loans were broken, and we know that, we've seen that, but I'm just going to re-emphasize that. The instrument that I held in my hand that I had faith and confidence to was almost impossible to see what those underlying elements of collateral were. And when I had the faith and confidence that those elements were safe, the underlying mortgages were failing. Right? And we couldn't see that. And of course, the other big example was Lehman. When Lehman collapsed, I was at one of the institutional banks at the time. We all got called in. And the first question we had was, what's our exposure to Lehman? And I said, well, great. Well, let's find out. Well, who is Lehman? No one can answer that question. And for those who are SQL nerds, doing a query that says where name equals Lehman didn't work either, because there was Neuberger Berman and there was lots of other names. So there was no easy way to aggregate all of the positions that were exposed to Lehman. So that created an obvious problem. Now, when I was with the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, I had the honor to work with colleagues in drafting what was called the linchpin paper. which was the proposal to create the legal entity identifier. Now, today, LEI, I believe we've got, I don't know, some of you may know better, 1.5 million or more legal entity identifiers issued globally. And you could argue whether it's clean or some of it needs to be fixed. Any process needs to be cleaned. But the interesting thing about LEI is pretty much it's been globally adopted except in the US. And for those of us here who initiated that, that's incredibly frustrating. We worked with the OFR. I heard mentions about the OFR, and I was part of the OFR in its early instantiation. Yes, the goal was for it to be independent. We never achieved that, right? So the OFR was pitching the LEI as well. Interesting opportunity we have now, the Financial Data Transparency Act. As you know, the FDTA has been passed. What I learned in my years within government was just because legislation passes doesn't mean you have to do it. Right? They now have to convince and build the business case for the implementation of the Financial Data Transparency Act. And that's being largely run right now by the agency under the FSOC. Different agencies are coming together and they're doing interviews and so forth. And I actually had an opportunity to provide expert testimony twice on the benefits of standards. In fact, one of my presentations, the person who was running that actually made that committee read the linchpin paper, which is probably pretty painful for that group to do, but again, to emphasize the importance of standards. Mike Ack, I think you also presented to that committee as well. So a number of us advocating standards have proposed to the FDTA. At this point, we're waiting to see what color comes out of the chimney, what color smoke comes out of the chimney. We don't know yet, right, where that's going to go. But the hope is that this is an opportunity to start to really drive adoption of information standards throughout the financial regulatory community. And all I can say right now is we just have to keep pushing and pressing and everything we've talked about today. And how does this dovetail back into ACTUS? Of course, ACTUS also represents standardization in contract representation and analytics. And by the way, you can't do analytics without data. And what is the purpose of doing data if not to enhance analytics? So there is absolutely an incredible relationship between those two. And I hope to exercises like this will continue to emphasize that.
Thank you. And now I'll call on Joe Langston. Thank you. I have, unfortunately, a little bit about myself is that as I've left Morgan Stanley in 2011. Okay.
Is it on?
There we go. Is that better? Okay. So I left Morgan Stanley in 2011 and I did some work in mathematics, et cetera, and returned to that's my first love. And I find that I'm going back to that. And one of the things that makes you do in mathematics is look to foundations. And so we asked ourselves, why do you need standards? And which is part of what we are talking about today. And the answer is standards are fundamental to communication. If you say you want to go out into the store, and I'll go back to what Alan said about bolts, and you wanted to buy a number 10, and you wanted to sell a number 10 bolt, you would know that you were actually transacting on the same thing because number 10 bolt has a meaning. Of course, if you went to France and you spoke French and you said number 10, you would probably get an M10, not an Imperial 10. So while the standards are important, there has to be as well a universal recognition of what the standards are or standards is. And that is one of the things that ACTUS is definitely trying to address. And it is then permissible within ACTUS if you have a bond position to be able to communicate that to your risk management, to your treasury group, to every operations group that has to touch that bond and know that using that ACTUS name will generate exactly the same ACTUS cash flow structure. Now, this brings us to two questions, is how many places is a bond actually touched in analytics? And if you've ever been in JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, and you had looked at, say, the derivatives, interest rate derivatives trading desk, you would realize that that bond will be touched on that desk. It'll be touched on the group head of structured trade, or in this case, interest rate trading. It'll be touched by the head of interest rate division. It'll be touched by risk management. I mean, God, you can go on forever and ever. But more importantly, it will also be touched in the mortgage-backed trading business, because they're going to hold bonds as well, U.S. Treasury bonds, et cetera. Now you've got some desks are long the bond and some desks are short the bond. And you really want to have one price, because if they're short 100 million and you're long 100 million, the bank should not be showing a profit or loss net. Got a zero position. That was not necessarily the case. Just so you know that. There are cases of desk trading against desk, and having a net position in the firm and not showing up that way. There are strange places in a bank that have nothing to do with treasury and liquidity of the bank, you might think, where something like ACTUS is critically important. Think of wealth management groups. Think of wealth management groups for large wealth individuals. Those ultra-rich groups, those ultra-rich individuals hold positions that are well equal or above the size of a small bank in terms of the net capital use. And for them, for the wealth management operations, is to know the liquidity and the risk of those positions. So now let's get back to ACTUS for a moment. It's not just within a bank. It's also where banks have very good systems. I mean, Goldman Sachs, SexDB, Morgan Stanley has spent millions on standardization. JP Morgan has a group that has also well-developed standards. And within them, they've sort of prevented the problem of one desk trading against the other, provided there's honesty there. That's a separate issue. We're not going to get into that today. And that's great. However, when they send it up to the regulators, they're sending up somewhat different standards. And it makes it much harder to develop for the regulators to do independent risk analysis and be able to do it on a much more frequent basis to be able to track it. Now, again, standards are the core to communication. In this case, we're communicating what the nature of a position is. There are two types of standards now. There's the notional or notational standard, and that's where you have a name, and attached to the name, you can identify different functions. And then you have something which ACTUS is, which is a different type of standard. It's a functional standard. It not only has a name that describes the position, but it has the algorithm that generates the promised cash flow from that position. That's an incredibly powerful difference, okay? Because now you know if you use the same analytics on the same set of positions, you'll get the same results, okay? And that means that communicators, that regulators can talk to each other and understand what's being said. And that's the incredible value of ACTUS and the need for standards. And at this point, we have 2 minutes for questions. And I assure you, if we go over, Willie's going to be really upset. So are there any questions? Wonderful. Willie?
Joe, I'll answer the question.
You didn't have to, you know.
Because the translation from the bank systems to a standard to be able to feed ACTUS is the gap. That's where we have the problem.
That's the
So-
expense, yeah.
So that's what we need to do. We need to address that translation from all these legacy systems into these cash flow algorithms.
We actually have looked at that. We did it for a small bank when we made our FDIC position. It is a solvable problem, but it is one that requires resources to do, and it's an expense. Banks are, I mean, no matter what you say, Goldman is not going to give up SecDB. It's been too valuable for them. And Morgan Stanley has just developed their own. They're not giving that up either. So we have to have the ability to translate.
But here's where, Mike, to your point, the reaction when you say that is firms think they have to undo everything they have historically and rebuild all new. And there are solutions through middleware solutions, certainly through advanced data architecture now and graph and semantic modeling, where you can create those translation layers at a much lower cost than the fear people have when they think about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. You don't have to rip out the old system if it's working, if it's good internally, but you do have to build the translation. Okay. Willie.
I only want to say the cost is usually overestimated. You know, I've mapped hundreds of systems, you know, and it's doable. You know, in simple case, like if you have a simple bank, like just mortgage or something like that, I think it's in the weeks or months. That's what it is.
I have my 10,000 systems.
Yeah, no, but that's for a bank, yeah.
When LEI was introduced, and the CFTC was the only institution that actually required it, I was one of the large banks and was given the task of converting our reporting to include LEI. And of course, that struck fear in everybody. And we had it done, I think, in 6 weeks. And then when I went back to management and said, let's do this for everything else, they said, not until we're told to do so.
That's back to yours.
Yes, it is. I was just going to say that means that you have to have people with relevant experience on the board, because if an IT consultant comes along and tells you it's going to cost X, Y, and Z, then they must be in a position to challenge that and to say what the doability, I think, is extremely important. I know that banks are very worried about their legacy systems and how to update those and the costs involved and the time involved and so forth. So just want to make another point about data, because what worries me very much about the importance, ever increasing importance of generative AI is certainty about the quality of data. And I'm not quite sure how we set about resolving that problem, but I think it's going to be an extremely important problem as time goes on.
The only thing I would say is banks seem to be more concerned with their legacy systems than with their legacy.